The wind off the Dakota Badlands doesn't announce itself. It doesn't build slowly the way storms do in storybooks. One moment the air is still enough to hear a prairie dog sneeze at 40 yards, and the next moment the world goes white and horizontal and so cold it burns the inside of your nose before you've even opened your mouth to yell for help. Settlers in the Dakota Territory in the early 1880s didn't call those storms blizzards as a matter of meteorology. They called them blizzards as a matter of religion. Because when one hit you full in the face on the open plain, you understood immediately and without argument that you were in the presence of something that didn't care whether you lived or died. On the morning of November 14, 1882, 17-year-old Marta Vasarhelyi stood on a wind-scoured patch of Burleigh County ground she technically owned, 160 acres of the ugliest real estate in the Northern Hemisphere, or so the other homesteaders had been telling her for 3 weeks. And she tried to figure out what to do with a cave. It wasn't much of a cave. It gaped beneath a limestone shelf on the northwest corner of her claim like a wound in the earth, roughly 9 feet deep by 14 feet wide and maybe 6 feet tall at the highest point. The floor was dry-packed dirt with a smell she couldn't name at first, old, mineral, like the inside of a church that had never been heated. The entrance faced mostly east, which one old-timer named Rutger Haas had already told her was worthless because the morning sun wouldn't warm it and the winter wind out of the northwest would pour right in. Haas ran the largest operation in the county, 480 acres of winter wheat and a half-dozen weathered outbuildings he'd thrown up over 7 years, and he'd padded the limestone shelf above the cave's mouth with a kind of dismissive fondness, the way a man pats a dog he doesn't own and doesn't want. Your grandfather's ghost could live there, Haas had told her, which was funny to exactly nobody, least of all Marta. Her grandfather was alive and well in Debrecen, Hungary, and was probably at that exact moment eating something warm. What was Marta Vasarhelyi doing on 160 acres of Dakota real estate at 17 years old, alone in late November, with a cave instead of a house? That's the part of the story that the county land records don't capture. Records capture the filing date, October 22, 1882, and the legal description of the quarter section, and the fee of $14 paid in full. Records don't capture the look on Marta's stepfather's face when he told her there was no more room. They don't capture the particular quality of cold that finds you when a wagon drops you at a crossroads and rattles away south toward Bismarck, and you realize you are now, in a legal and geographical and utterly practical sense, on your own. She'd had 3 weeks since the filing. 3 weeks to turn 160 acres of Dakota prairie into something that wouldn't kill her. She had a second-hand tent, a cast-iron skillet that had belonged to her mother before typhoid took her mother the previous April, a hand axe, a shovel with a cracked handle wrapped in rawhide, 60 pounds of dried corn and salt pork and dried beans in a canvas sack, and $11.40 in coin sewn into the lining of her coat. She had strong hands from 3 years of doing every chore on her stepfather's Stutzman County claim. She had a memory that worked like a trap. Once something went in, it didn't come out until she needed it, and she had the cave. Nobody else wanted the cave. Now, there are people who would tell you that a 17-year-old girl, newly alone on the Dakota prairie in the fall of 1882, was a tragedy waiting to happen. Those people would not be entirely wrong. The Dakota Territory claimed more than 300 settlers to exposure and starvation in the winter of 1882 to 1883. A winter that meteorological records from Fort Yates later documented as the coldest sustained stretch in the northern plains since record-keeping began, with temperatures plunging to -41 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 consecutive days in late January. The nearest doctor to Marta's claim was 23 miles south in Bismarck. Her nearest neighbor, Halvor Strand, a Norwegian bachelor of about 50, who grew a magnificent beard and spoke very little English, was 1 3/4 miles to the east. The nearest woman her own age was probably in St. Paul. What Marta had instead of neighbors was the cave, and the memory of something she'd read in a Hungarian agricultural journal, a worn copy that had traveled with her family from Debrecen, about the ancient practice of building wine cellars into hillsides to maintain temperature. The journal was old, written in the formal agricultural Hungarian of her grandfather's generation, and it talked about how Earth maintains a temperature of between 50 and 58 degrees Fahrenheit year-round at depths greater than 4 feet, regardless of the temperature at the surface. She'd been maybe 12 years old when she read that. She hadn't known it was going to matter. If you're finding this story compelling, consider subscribing before we go further. This channel exists to document the practical knowledge of America's frontier generation, the hard-won techniques and stubborn ingenuity that kept ordinary people alive in extraordinary circumstances. Thousands of people have subscribed to help preserve these stories, and every new subscriber helps make sure they don't disappear. Join the effort before we continue. 3 other homesteaders held claims within 4 miles of Marta's quarter section, and every single one of them thought she was making a mistake. Rutger Haas we've already met, a Prussian-born man of 53 who'd homesteaded in Dakota Territory in 1875 and survived 2 blizzards by sheer stubbornness and a well-constructed sod house. He was not unkind to Marta. He simply didn't believe a cave made sense when there was perfectly good sod within a day's cutting. You dig down, you dig sideways, you stack your blocks, you are inside, Haas told her on her second day, in his blunt mix of German syntax and English vocabulary. This is proven. The cave is not proven. He had a point. Sod houses, soddies everyone called them, were the dominant housing technology on the treeless plains for a reason. They worked. 12-inch thick walls of compressed grass and clay root systems acted as natural insulation, maintaining interior temperatures 20 to 30 degrees warmer than outside air during the worst winter cold. Haas had helped build 41 of them in 7 years. He could cut sod blocks, haul them, stack them, and have a livable structure in 4 days. Half a mile south, the Swedish family named Lindqvist, Oscar and his wife Britta, and their 3 children, had arrived that same October. Oscar had been a carpenter in Gothenburg, and in 31 days had built a frame house using lumber hauled from Bismarck, milled boards, a proper roof, a floor that didn't grow grass if you left it alone. He came by on Marta's 3rd day and stood at the cave mouth with his thumbs in his suspenders and shook his head. The cold comes through the ground, he told her, which wasn't accurate but was what he believed. You need walls. Walls stop cold. He offered to help her haul lumber from Bismarck in the spring. He meant it genuinely. Marta thanked him and kept digging, because Marta was digging. That's the thing about this story that the county land records do capture, indirectly. The claim was filed on October 22nd, and by the first week of November, 3 neighbors had independently come by to watch the teenage Hungarian girl with the cracked-handled shovel excavating the cave with a systematic thoroughness that puzzled all of them. She wasn't digging it out for a root cellar. She wasn't digging a new cave. She was deepening and widening the existing one and doing it in a specific pattern that none of her neighbors recognized, because none of them had read the Hungarian Agricultural Journal. The journal described a principle that Romano-Hungarian winemakers had used since at least the 16th century: thermal mass and earth insulation working together in a space partially sunk into the ground. The deeper the floor below grade, the more stable the temperature. The more earth on the walls and ceiling, the better the insulation against outside temperature swings. A space entirely underground stays near the Earth's mean annual temperature, in Burleigh County, approximately 44 degrees Fahrenheit. A space with a floor 5 feet below grade, 2-foot thick earth walls, and an earthen roof would stay between 38 and 52 degrees through winter without any heat source at all. Add even a small stove burning minimal fuel and you had comfortable sleeping temperatures. Marta was 17, not an engineer. She was working from a memory of a description she'd read at 12 in a text meant for Hungarian vintners. But she was working from something, which was more than most people on that prairie had. By November 8th, she'd deepened the cave floor by 26 inches, widened it to 18 feet across and 11 feet deep. She'd salvaged lumber from an abandoned homestead 3 miles east, a claim that failed in spring, to frame a proper door opening and hang a double-thickness door stuffed with dry grass. She angled the entrance northeast, using the limestone shelf to block the northwest wind. She chinked the walls with a clay and grass mixture learned from watching her stepfather work a root cellar. She cut sod blocks and laid them over the limestone shelf above, adding 14 inches of insulating turf to the natural stone ceiling. 40 hours of hard labor, 6 salvaged boards, and a bucket of clay. What she ended up with was a space that held 47 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of November 10th, with no fire burning, while the outside air sat at 18 degrees above zero. That's a 29-degree difference with zero fuel consumption. Halvorstrand's sod house, by comparison, required a continuous wood fire to maintain a livable interior temperature, and wood was expensive in treeless Dakota. A cord went for $3.50 in Bismarck, and hauling it added another $1.50 per load. What Marta had built was not elegant. It was not comfortable by any standard that her neighbors would have recognized as aspirational. It was, by their assessment, a hole in the ground where a poor girl was going to spend a miserable winter. Rutger Haas said so directly, with some sympathy, when he came by on November 12th and found her laying in a bedroll at the back of the cave with a small oil lamp burning and a book open on her chest. The interior of the cave was 52 degrees, she told him. He looked at the thermometer she held up, a small tin instrument she'd traded the Lindqvist children 3 biscuits for. He looked at his breath, which was steaming in the cold November air outside. He looked back at the thermometer. 52, he said. He walked around the outside of the cave entrance and came back in and stood there for a moment. You are not cold. It was not quite a question. Not very, Marta said. He left without saying anything further, which was, from Rutger Haas, approximately the highest form of compliment. 2 days later, on November 14th, the first real storm of 1882 arrived. It started as a gray smear on the northwest horizon at about 10 in the morning, the kind of cloud formation that experienced plains settlers described as a wall. Not scattered clouds building, not an overcast thickening. A wall. A curtain of weather moving horizontally at 40 miles per hour, carrying snow that was less like individual flakes and more like ground glass, the kind of snow that finds every gap in your clothing and your buildings and your plans. Halvor Strand saw it coming from his place and drove his livestock into his sod barn in under 20 minutes. The Lindqvists shuttered their windows and banked their stove. Rutger Haas, who had seen this before, put on his coat and his hat and walked half a mile to make sure the Lindqvist children had enough wood on the porch. Nobody thought to check on Marta Vasarhelyi. This is the moment in the story where you might expect panic. A 17-year-old girl, 3 weeks on her own, a hole in the ground for shelter, and a Dakota blizzard bearing down at 40 miles per hour. But Marta's surviving journal, a composition book she'd bought in Bismarck the day she filed her claim, which ended up in the State Historical Society of North Dakota, through a chain of custody that took 80 years. Records November 14th with a matter-of-factness that is either the product of extreme stoicism or extreme confidence. Probably both. The entry for that day reads, in translation from Hungarian, storm came at midday, brought in water and fuel, door holds well, temperature inside 49 degrees, comfortable. She had laid in 31 gallons of water in clay jugs, 40 pounds of dried corn and beans, 15 pounds of salt pork, and a small cured sausage kept for special occasions. Her tin stove was installed through a clay-lined hole at the rear of the cave, venting through a pipe mortared into a crack in the limestone. Burning nothing more than dried prairie grass and buffalo chips, it could heat the 9 by 18-foot space to 68 degrees. Prairie grass burns fast and cool, but in a thermally stable space already sitting at 47 degrees, fast-burning fuel is sufficient. She burned about 6 pounds of dried grass per day through that first storm and never let the temperature inside drop below 55 degrees. Outside, the storm dropped 22 inches of snow in 31 hours and drove temperatures to -8 degrees Fahrenheit. The Lindqvist frame house lost its east-facing window shutters to the wind in the first night, and Oscar spent 4 hours nailing boards over the gap in -8-degree air. He burned nearly a full cord of wood in those 31 hours. The single-layer roof, the uninsulated floor, the gapped board walls all becoming vectors for cold the stove could barely overcome. Rutger Haas's sod house performed as promised. Thick walls, interior never dropping below 42 degrees. But Haas was 53 with a bad knee and 7 years of fuel stockpile, and he had not opened his door in 2 days by the time the storm broke on November 16th. Marta walked out of her cave at 7:30 in the morning on November 16th into a world so white it seemed to have forgotten it had ever been any other color. The snow lay in 4-foot drifts on the north and west sides of the limestone shelf, and the cave entrance was entirely buried, which, she noted in her journal with that same matter-of-fact tone, was interesting, because the buried entrance had actually made the interior warmer. The snow acted as an additional layer of insulation. The temperature inside, when she checked before pushing the door open, was 61 degrees. Her small stove had been cold for 6 hours. This is the kind of result worth pausing on. 61 degrees Fahrenheit inside a cave, no fire burning during a blizzard that brought -8 degrees outside, represents a 69-degree differential. Haas's sod house managed roughly 42 degrees with no fire, a 50-degree differential. The Lindqvists' frame house dropped to an estimated 28 degrees in the unheated back room when the fire was low. The worthless cave was outperforming both of them, and it wasn't close. Before we go any further into what happened next, and what happened next involves a crisis that would put every one of these decisions to the ultimate test. If this story is connecting with something in you, if you value the idea that ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances figured out how to survive by paying attention to the world around them, please consider giving this video a like. It helps other people find this content, and it helps this channel continue documenting the knowledge that the frontier generation earned the hard way. Marta spent the morning of November 16th digging a path to the Strand property. She hadn't seen Halvor Strand in 4 days and wanted to know if he was alive. Partly because a dead neighbor was a problem, partly because Strand had been quietly helpful since she'd arrived, appearing with a piece of lumber or a bucket of buffalo chips and leaving without ceremony. He was alive, but nursing a badly inflamed right hand. Cold air through a gap in his sod wall had frozen the skin while he slept, and he'd been treating it with tallow and keeping it wrapped. It wasn't getting better. Marta's mother had known something about cold injuries, the treatment of frostbitten tissue, from Hungarian folk medicine that Marta had absorbed incidentally. You don't warm frozen tissue quickly with direct heat. You warm it slowly in tepid water and keep it from refreezing while circulation returns. Fire or hot water causes tissue damage that slow rewarming does not. She told Strand this in a mix of halting Norwegian, his halting English, and substantial pantomime, and brought him back to the cave. 54 degrees inside by noon. A shallow basin of water warmed to about 104 degrees on her small stove, hand-soaking for 40 minutes. The color came back slowly, without the burning agony of rapid rewarming. Strand looked around the cave while he soaked. The chinked walls, the sod ceiling, the double door. The stove vented through mortared limestone. He put his good hand on the wall and held it there a moment. When they were done and he was eating salt pork and cornbread, he said something in Norwegian that Marta translated in her journal as, "You built a good house." The winter of 1882 to 1883 in Burleigh County came in waves, each more committed than the last. December brought 3 storms, including a 4-day blow that dropped 31 inches of snow total. Temperatures averaged 8 degrees Fahrenheit for the month, with several nights reaching -22. The Lindqvists burned through their entire winter wood supply by December 28th and made an emergency purchase from Rutger Haas at a price Oscar's journal described as punishing. Marta burned 210 pounds of dried prairie grass and 40 pounds of buffalo chips through the whole month. Prairie grass she cut herself from unclaimed land at no cost. Halvor Strand began leaving small bundles at her entrance in quiet reciprocity. Haas came by on December 30th and stood in the cave entrance and watched his breath. His breath was not steaming. 53 degrees inside, 11 below zero outside. 7 years in Dakota Territory, more shelters built than he could count. And he'd never thought about the difference between making a space warm and making a space stable. His sod house was warm when the fire was hot and cold when it wasn't. This was stable, day or night, storm or calm, within a 12-degree range, asking for almost nothing. You don't fight the cold, Marta told him. You use the earth to make the cold irrelevant. He thought about it and said she should tell the Lindqvists. She had already. Oscar had nodded politely and gone home to his frame house. The real test, the crisis that this whole story has been building toward without anyone on those 160 Dakota acres knowing it, came in January of 1883, specifically in the period between January 19th and January 29th, which the Fort Yates meteorological records later documented as the most severe cold stretch of the entire decade. The temperature dropped to -31 degrees Fahrenheit on January 20th. It reached -41 on January 23rd. Wind chill calculations weren't in common use in 1883. but modern meteorologists who have analyzed the Fort Yates records estimate the effective temperature at -70 to -80 degrees Fahrenheit on the worst nights, accounting for wind speed. At -41, wood fires are not adequate for frame construction. The Lindqvist house, already depleted of its winter wood supply and operating on emergency replenishment from Haas, became genuinely dangerous on January 20th. Oskar Lindqvist could not maintain a temperature above 28 degrees Fahrenheit in the main room, despite burning wood at a rate he couldn't sustain. His youngest child, Astrid, 4 years old, small for her age, developed a cough on the night of the 21st that her mother Britta recognized immediately as the beginning of something serious. Children got sick in cold houses. Children got pneumonia. Children died of pneumonia in Dakota Territory, with 23 miles between them and a doctor. Britta Lindqvist made the decision. She wrapped all 3 children in every blanket in the house. She told Oskar she was taking them to Marta's. This is the moment in Britta Lindqvist's own diary, a Swedish language account that her granddaughter eventually donated to the Swedish American Historical Society, where she describes arriving at what she called the cave in the snow, because by late January the entire entrance to Marta's cave was buried except for the stovepipe poking through the snow and the small cleared path that Marta kept shoveled for ventilation. Britta had to knock on what appeared to be a snowbank to get an answer. The snowbank opened. Inside was a 56-degree space with a small stove burning, a lamp on a shelf, a girl of 17 sitting up from her bedroll to see who was knocking, and an interior that Britta Lindqvist described in her diary as warm like a hand. She put that phrase in Swedish. Varm som en hand. Warm like a hand. The warmth you feel when someone puts a warm hand over your cold one. Not hot. Not aggressive. Present and reliable and exactly enough. The 3 Lindqvist children, Carl, Ingrid, and small Astrid with her cough, slept in Marta's cave from January 21st through January 27th. Halvar Strand was already there, having come over on the 19th when it became clear the cold was going to be sustained and severe. Oskar Lindqvist came with more wood on the 22nd and stayed. For 6 days, 5 people lived in a cave that was 9 feet deep and 18 feet wide, and the temperature inside never dropped below 48 degrees and never rose above 64 degrees, sustained by nothing more than a small tin stove burning prairie grass and buffalo chips, the insulating capacity of 4 to 6 feet of Dakota earth on all sides, and the Earth's own mean annual temperature. Astrid Lindqvist's cough improved within 24 hours of entering the cave. It was gone by the 3rd day. Her mother's diary records this with a directness that leaves nothing to interpretation. The child's lungs healed when they stopped being subjected to air that was 28 degrees Fahrenheit and started breathing air that was 56 degrees. This is not complicated medicine. It is, however, the difference between a child who survived the winter of 1882 to 1883 in Burleigh County, Dakota Territory, and a child who might not have. Rutger Haas visited on January 25th. He was fine in his sod house, as he always was, because his sod house was genuinely excellent, and found 5 people in Marta's cave eating Britta Lindqvist's salt pork and dried apple Johnny cakes and talking in 3 languages at once. He stood in the entrance for a moment with his hands on his hips, and his expression was the one that, according to both Oskar Lindqvist's journal and Marta's own record, could only be described as a man reassessing a conclusion he'd already reached once. He had told her in November that the cave was not proven. He was looking at proof. "How did you know?" he asked her in his German-inflected English. And Marta, who was 17 years old, who had been kicked out of her stepfather's house with $11.40 and a cracked-handled shovel, who had turned a worthless cave into the only genuinely warm space in a 4-mile radius during the worst cold snap of the decade, considered the question for a moment. "I read it," she said. Haas looked at her for another moment. "From where?" "A book about wine." He thought about this. He nodded slowly, the way a Prussian farmer nods when a piece of information is simultaneously sensible and completely unexpected. Then he came in and sat down and ate a Johnny cake. The cold broke on January 29th as suddenly as it had arrived. The temperature climbed to -12, then 0, then 14 degrees above 0 within 36 hours. The Lindqvist went home to their frame house. Halvar Strand went back to his sod house. Marta walked outside and stood in the January sun, still thin and pale as a watered milk, but actual sun. and looked at the cave entrance dug into the hillside and the snow banked all around it, and thought about nothing in particular for a few minutes. She had, according to her January 29th journal entry, not been warmer than 48 degrees in 38 days. She had not been cold enough to be dangerous in 38 days. Her heating costs for January, the most brutal January in a decade, had been approximately 60 pounds of dried prairie grass and 20 pounds of buffalo chips. She had not once wished, during any of those 38 days, that she'd built a sod house. Now, there are people reading history backward from comfort who would tell you that Marta was lucky. Lucky that she'd read the right book. Lucky that the cave happened to be in the right spot. Lucky that her neighbors needed shelter and could come to her rather than the other way around. And there's a version of this story where luck is the explanation, and we leave it there. But consider what luck means in this context. Marta Vasarhelyi had been handed nothing. Not a warm house, not a family, not a claim with a creek or a woodlot or even a flat field. She'd been handed 160 acres of rocky hillside with a cave that 4 experienced frontier settlers had dismissed in 2 minutes flat. She'd turned that dismissal into a survival advantage not because she was lucky, but because she'd paid attention to something she'd read at 12 years old and kept it. And when the world handed her a cave, she asked what a cave was for before assuming she already knew. That's not luck. That's a habit of mind. The spring of 1883 brought reckoning across Burleigh County. 3 families in Emmons County had lost members to exposure in January. A family in Kidder County abandoned their claim entirely. Rutger Haas arrived at Marta's cave on April 12th and stood in the entrance, no steaming breath, temperature inside already at 51 degrees, outside air a raw 29, and asked her a question. He had 80 feet of south-facing limestone outcropping on his claim, he said. Would she help him think through what to build into it? He'd been asking around, and a Norwegian settler in Morton County said they'd been building into hillsides back home for 300 years. A German family in Kidder County said their grandparents in Bavaria had always built into slopes. An old Mandan man near Fort Yates had pointed out, with the patience of someone explaining a very obvious thing to someone slow to understand, that the Mandan had been building earth lodges in the Missouri River valleys since before any European had heard the word Dakota. It seems, Haas said, that everyone already knew this except us. Marta agreed that this seemed to be the case. The structure Haas built that spring recorded 49 degrees Fahrenheit on its first cold night. Outside air at 21 degrees, no fire burning. He burned 2 cords of wood that winter. He had previously burned 7. Nobody in Burleigh County called the cave worthless anymore. Oscar Lindqvist told anyone who'd listened that his only regret was not listening to the 17-year-old in the cave 3 years earlier. His wife Britta named her 4th child, born in the cave on a cold April night in 1884, with Marta as the only assistance available, Marta Astrid Lindqvist. The State Historical Society of North Dakota acquired Marta's composition book journal and the Lindqvist family diaries in the 1960s. Those records confirm what the Fort Yates meteorological files document. The one structure in a 4-mile radius requiring the least fuel and maintaining the most stable conditions through an 11-day extreme cold event was a worthless cave. Modern building science calls what Marta built passive thermal design. Earth-sheltered construction using thermal mass and ground contact insulation maintains interior temperatures within 15 to 20 degrees of the Earth's mean annual temperature with zero mechanical heating. The U.S. Department of Energy has published analyses showing earth-sheltered homes in northern climates use 50 to 70% less heating energy than comparable above-grade frame construction. Romano-Hungarian vintners were applying these principles in the 16th century. Mandan earth lodge builders were applying them in the Missouri River Valley long before that. The practice exists on every continent, in every culture that has faced cold climate and limited fuel. It is older than the word homestead. It is older than the word America. What Marta Vasarhelyi added to that ancient tradition was a 17-year-old girl, alone, in November, with a very good memory. Her journal entry for April 12, 1883, the night Haas came to ask about the limestone outcropping, records a thought she'd apparently been carrying since November. He said everyone already knew. That's true. The Mandan people knew it. The Hungarian winemakers knew it. The German farmers and the Norwegian farmers knew it. They all figured it out in different places and called it different things. But they figured out the same thing. The Earth wants to stay at 44 degrees, and if you ask nicely, it will take you with it. 44 degrees. Not warmth by any Eastern city standard. Not comfortable by the measure of people who have always had enough wood. But stable, reliable. The quiet, permanent hospitality of ground that doesn't care about the weather at the surface. Available to anyone willing to go low enough, and still enough, to receive it. The cave is still there. The limestone shelf, the shoulder of rock that blocked the northwest wind, the east-facing entrance she chose by reasoning rather than instinct, all of it still registered in Burleigh County records under a notation about a historic earth-sheltered structure on the northwest corner, intact. The sod houses are gone. The Lindqvist frame house is gone. The cave has been there since before any of them were born. What was worthless in October of 1882 was never the cave. It was the assumption that a girl with a cracked-handled shovel and a 12-year-old's memory of a wine journal couldn't know something that 4 experienced men had missed. That assumption cost the Lindqvists a winter's worth of wood and nearly cost them their youngest daughter. It cost Haas 7 years of excess fuel expense. It cost Marta nothing, because she'd already stopped listening before the first storm hit. She'd gone back to the shovel instead. If the story of Marta Vasarhelyi and the worthless cave resonated with you, if there's something in the idea of a young woman reading the earth instead of surrendering to it, of ancient knowledge outlasting every assumption about who's allowed to hold it, then this channel asks one thing of you: subscribe. Not because this channel needs the numbers, but because every subscriber is a signal that these stories matter, that the frontier generation's hard-won knowledge is worth preserving, worth telling carefully, worth keeping alive in a world that moves very fast and forgets very easily. Thousands of people have already subscribed for that reason. Join them, help keep the record intact. And whatever winter finds you in, whether it's a Dakota blizzard or something colder and less meteorological, remember that the Earth is offering you 44 degrees, and sometimes that's exactly enough.